everyone. This is Lindsay O'Donnell Welch with Threatpost, and I am joined today by Matt Olney, the director of Talos's Threat Intelligence and Interdiction at Cisco. So Matt has been working with election officials firsthand to make sure that they are prepared for the November presidential election. And he's also spent the past 4 years studying election security and misinformation and all these different security threats that we're seeing related to the elections. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Now, the elections are right around the corner, and we're seeing a ton of news about, the debates and kind of the political part of it. But a big undercurrent that we're seeing with this upcoming election is security and kind of disinformation campaigns. So first of all, let's set the context here for this upcoming election in comparison to previous elections. What are kind of the similarities that we're seeing and the differences we're seeing going into November 2020 as opposed to 2016?
I think we're seeing far less active exploitation in 2020 than we saw in 2016. There's a general agreement between the intelligence community and the security industry that there is not a lot of evidence of active, what we would traditionally think of hacking into election systems, election infrastructure. And what activity that we have seen is generally coinciding with activity you would see anywhere on the internet. So we think it's just attempts that you would have just by virtue of being part of the internet as opposed to being elections specific. What we do continue to see, as we saw in 2016, is a lot of disinformation, a lot of misinformation, both foreign sourced and domestically sourced, and that is what does look like 2016.
Mm-hmm. Right. I feel like also, we're seeing kind of the cyber criminal piece of all this, but I do think, on a positive note that there is a lot more awareness. I feel like I've personally, from a news side, I've seen a lot more crackdown from Facebook and Twitter on different disinformation campaigns, and they're being a lot more vocal about the fact that their platforms are being leveraged in this way. So, I think that is kind of a good step forward. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, cyber criminals are also recognizing that this new awareness from social media platforms is happening, and they're consequently kind of switching up their own tactics. Have you seen kind of new techniques and new methods being utilized from the cyber criminal front?
No, I haven't seen a lot of differences, but I would echo your understanding of that defensive difference between 2016 and 2020, where across the board, both on misinformation, disinformation, and like traditional computer security issues, a great deal more kind of awareness in the election community, but also in the general public.
Right. I think that's a really good point to make. And taking a step back, I feel like the election cybersecurity problem that we're facing is two-forked in that we have election security, which impacts the infrastructure itself and kind of the security of election machines and whatnot. And then we also have disinformation. So, looking at, as you say, this content that's being spread and consumed online and on social media. So what would you say is kind of the bigger issue that that is facing us, the U.S., as we go into the presidential elections, at least for this year, of those two issues?
Right. Well, while I agree that they are separate from like on how to address them, mm-hmm. those two, in our assessment, those two kind of prongs of the problem are tightly coupled. So even in the 2016 operations, those, like, for example, the hack of the DNC, right. The stealing of Podesta's email, all that was in actions in order to further disinformation campaigns. So we see those kind of as two actions with a common kind of purpose. And so what we want kind of everyday Americans to understand is that election security includes them.
Hmm.
It isn't something just for the Secretary of States and county auditors and Board of Elections, depending on where you are, to worry about. It is something for each American who's concerned about democracy to kind of to be concerned with. So everybody has a role in that. So disinformation currently, I would say, is the kind of the most prevalent and the most pressing issue. Um, but that the solution for that has to come from better information hygiene from the public, better communication pathways from the federal, state, and local governments, and a general level of patience, so that if there is an issue, that it can be resolved within like the correct procedures that have been laid out.
Hmm. Right, right. And I know, we there was a both Microsoft and Google Tag warned of attempted cyber attacks on both Trump and Biden's campaign staffers earlier. I think it was earlier in June. So that's an issue as well. I feel like there's always kind of new incidents that are surfacing on the election security front.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that the point of election hacking, the point of disinformation campaigns isn't to be successful in hacking or disinformation campaigns. These are politically motivated actions that are looking to achieve a political end.
Right.
And so they will go after whatever mechanisms they feel will further those ends. And so campaign security is also a really important piece, and probably one of the most challenging pieces, because they're temporary environments, they're generally under resourced and understaffed. They kind of come up real quickly, they get turned down very quickly, and it's difficult to build. Particularly if you kind of go down ticket, it's difficult to build super secure campaign infrastructure, kind of on a temporary, low budget method. So yeah, there are people. There are people in other countries whose job every day is to find a way to achieve the political ends that they're being set, and they will go after campaigns. They will go after election infrastructure, but ultimately their goal is to go after the minds of the American people and their trust in the democratic institutions that we use to select our leaders.
Right, right. And kind of piggybacking off of that point, disinformation has really become more of an industry and much more sophisticated over the past few years, as I'm sure you've seen. And state-sponsored threat groups are working even with kind of at this point independent third-party entities who are private digital marketing companies to engage in these global influencing operations. So it's really become something that is a lot more of an industry here. And I know that Cisco Talos has done a ton of research into how that's playing out and what that means. What's kind of the impact there? And, what can you give us kind of a look into how this industry works?
When you talk to the researchers, disinformation is a pretty broad topic, but when you talk to the researchers that kind of dug into the infrastructure components, they were really surprised to find this kind of emerging disinformation as a service market. And there's, lots of companies globally that carefully advertise their services, and they don't come out and say, hey, we're going to mislead people and lie about stuff, but ultimately that is the services that they're providing, and expertise in kind of dirty tricks. And ultimately, I mean, that's a kind of anathema to Western democracy, even though it's kind of got a history. You have to have an informed electorate for this all to work, and they have to be informed by truths, not by mistruths.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I feel like a lot of recent news stories that I've seen relating to election security too, what attackers will do is they'll compromise legitimate, news organizations or third-party websites, and they'll input their own content into that. So it seems like they're really taking steps to make their material more legitimate and really trying to kind of raise the bar there.
Yeah, they've done a lot like that. They've created their own news organizations to kind of run, and then hope that those kind of news organizations, that traditional media will pick up their stories without doing a real good fact check. But on the extreme end, certainly they could compromise news organizations and place stories. I think that generally is a less successful path for them because it's something that can ultimately kind of backfire.
Mm-hmm.
But they're much more interested in kind of corrupting the information pathways to the public by inserting these stories kind of off the fringes at the low levels in the collective thought processes of people to kind of get it to seep into traditional media and then kind of distribute it more broadly.
Right, right. So switching gears for a second, I also wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier about, further awareness on the end of social media consumers. And you also had mentioned kind of the need for more awareness coming from the government in terms of kind of relaying these threats and concerns. I think that I'm curious if there is more of awareness on the side of the federal government and election vendors as well, because, for instance, I know in August that voting machine maker election systems and software formally announced a vulnerability disclosure policy. And I'm curious if that's indicative of more awareness when it comes to infrastructure security related to elections, or if we still have kind of a ways to go there in terms of the relationship between this industry and the security space.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been pretty consistent on our side is we've been optimistic about elections in general because we look at it as an industry, and what we're seeing is a maturation of their security, processes and understanding. And we've seen it before. We've seen it with companies that are now seen as security leaders in terms of folks like Adobe and Microsoft, where they had to come to an understanding of how to work with the security community, how to develop securely, how to apply resources to security while still maintaining profitability. And that takes time, and despite the fact that there's people out there that have gone through it and security experts and everything else, the industry itself has to come to those conclusions ultimately and learn those lessons for themselves. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing an incredibly engaged election community that are truly aware of the threats and very keen to dig in on security issues. In addition to the example you gave, the state of Ohio, Secretary of State's Office of Ohio recently announced a bug bounty as well, or at least information, a kind of a disclosure policy for vulnerabilities.
Right.
It's not a bug bounty. And so that's part of creating a safe space for experts to convey their findings, and that's important. And so part of what Ohio did was say, if you do these things within the following very reasonable constraints, then you will not be subject to any kind of penalty. And so it creates a safe space for talented and motivated experts to examine those systems and then provide their findings back to the state. Mm-hmm. And it'll be the same thing with the SNS, and those are important. And I would hope that other voting machine vendors are quick to follow their lead.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I also wanted to ask, this is obviously a very strange election year. We've got COVID-19, we've got PPE loans, and I think normally that there would be a lot more not just cyber criminal focus, but news focus and a lot more focus on the elections. But we've also are in the middle of a pandemic here, and there's a ton of other current events that are happening as well. Are you seeing the pandemic changing how cyber criminals are approaching election security? Have you seen any kind of notable differences this year between previous years, or is it kind of the same as normal?
I think it's the same as normal. I think the difference is that you have more folks working at home. I mean, where it's affected the election, of course, is you have states that are trying to very quickly change how votes are cast and counted. And any election security person you talk to, any election expert will tell you that mail-in voting can be done securely. what the kind of the challenge that we have now is that what we're doing is on many states that haven't traditionally relied heavily on mail-in voting are now having to turn to it, very compressed time frame, and that compressed time frame is what's challenging more than it is about anything else. So that's kind of like in terms of election security, that's certainly the place where the pandemic has had the most impact. But more broadly, there are certainly concerns about actors, but I don't see a rush to do anything other than perhaps ride the concerns about it and kind of have custom spam that has COVID-19 themed messaging more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, before we wrap up, I did want to ask, are there any kind of future threats that you foresee that we need to look out for when it comes to, election security threats in the future? I know that there's always emerging technologies and innovation like deep fakes or whatnot that are being leveraged by cyber criminals. What are you seeing from your perspective?
I have a pretty firm rule against making guesses about the future, just because a lot of folks have failed to make calls on what's changed in the past, and I'm not special in that regard either. What I would say, kind of as a kind of a closer instead, is that to reiterate that everybody has a role in election security, and that includes the election community, who have, I assert, gone after that problem aggressively over the last 4 years. The public, which has largely, has largely kind of adopted a more skeptical sort of eye towards information as it comes out, for better or worse. But politicians also have a role, and they have to ensure that they are not handing victories to our adversaries, for the sake of votes. And so they have to speak carefully, and they have to reinforce American democracy, and they have to work towards making sure that all voters understand that their votes are desired and welcome and will be counted properly.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I do appreciate us kind of you ending this on a more positive note in terms of what we can, look out, what we can do to, better spread awareness and kind of as we look at election security moving forward. So, Matt, thank you again for joining us today on Threatpost Now to talk a little bit more about election security.
It's good to talk to you again. Thank you.
Great. And once again, this is Lindsay O'Donnell Welch with Threatpost. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe to our Threatpost YouTube channel. And if you have any comments or questions or your own thoughts and observations, please do leave a comment on our Threatpost YouTube page. Thanks again for tuning in to Threatpost Now.